It would just be a shame if that status quo entirely came back without some understanding, wow, when we had to, we really changed, and we made changes quick, and we adjusted on the fly, and it was the best thing for our patients, the best thing for our staff, the best thing for our providers. There's probably some lessons in that we should keep forever.
When it comes to cardiovascular care on the organizational level, MedAxiom, an ACC company, understands the challenges your program is facing. Welcome to MedAxiom Heart Talk, the podcast where thought leaders come together for one ultimate goal: to continually transform and optimize cardiovascular care for all. MedAxiom Heart Talk starts now.
Hi, everyone. It's Cheryl Toth, host of MedAxiom Heart Talk. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, providers, CMS, state agencies, others have been adapting their systems and implementing change at lightning speed. The results are keeping patients and providers safer, and telemedicine visits in particular have been a big win. But what happens after the COVID-19 crisis is over? Will these adaptations last? Will leaders keep pushing positive change forward? To explore these questions, we've invited MedAxiom's Executive VP Consulting, Joel Sauer, to the podcast today. Joel has decades of executive leadership experience and advises CV leaders across the country on how to accelerate change and transition to value. Joel, thanks for being with us today on MedAxiom Heart Talk.
You're welcome, Cheryl, and thanks for having me.
Joel, you and the MedAxiom team recently wrote an article, it was just released, called Reinventing Cardiovascular Care in 2 Weeks, an Industry Adapts to a Pandemic. And in that, you and the team write that while COVID-19 first entered the U.S. at the beginning of the year, until mid-March, things were pretty much business as usual. There were no reports of furloughed staff, no mass cancellations of patient appointments or procedures, and no plans to radically change the care delivery model. But of course, now, as we know, things have changed drastically. So why don't you describe for us what you think happened in the cardiovascular community in just 2 weeks?
Sure, and I would predict that for the entire world, this pandemic has taken hold in an incredibly short amount of time. And healthcare was on the front lines of that transition because direct patient care obviously puts providers and staff and others at risk because they can't control who comes in to their exam rooms or where they've been. And it's not something that we have historically needed to worry ourselves with, or certainly not ask and check. Right. You know, have you been out of the country in the last 2 weeks? Have you been exposed to anybody with symptoms that are consistent with what we now know with COVID? But I was on an airplane in the first week of March at a client, which was a health system. And the next day, literally, when I got home, there were starting to be announcements of visitors not allowed in hospitals and health systems, particularly if they had come through airports, and because of the globalization of our society. Yeah. So the reaction by the cardiovascular community was within probably 10 days, we saw dramatic reductions in patient visits, most being diverted to telehealth, but a lot of them just being put off. All elective cases most elective cases were discontinued. And Cheryl, this didn't happen universally across the country. Different geographies had to react or did react faster, and it took longer in others. But pretty much now the entire community has live and in-person visits to only those things that absolutely require the provider and the staff to be in front of that patient. So it's been a pretty remarkable transition.
It really has been, and like we said, it's really been weeks. And this move, Joel, from the typical, what we see in healthcare, go slow, study it first approach to act now, act fast because of this external factor, it's more like a design thinking mindset than what we often see in healthcare. So you recently covered that in a blog. You talked about a 5-step framework. Why don't you explain that, what a design thinking mindset is, and give us a few examples of how providers and other members, what you're seeing out there, how they're using design thinking to adapt so quickly.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, this is not a traditional trait of the healthcare industry, and being adaptable, that is, and doing it in such a quick time frame. Now, there is obviously the worldwide pandemic crisis on top of the industry, and that was the major driver. But it was fascinating to me to watch how quickly that change came about, and knowing intimately how decisions get made in healthcare organizations outside of a crisis, I was intrigued by how rapidly they were able to get these things through.
Yeah.
And many of them followed that 5-step process that you mentioned. And that process is used by some of the big tech companies in the United States, including Google and others. And that's where it was kind of a light bulb to say, I just saw this at a presentation, and the presenter was talking to a healthcare audience saying, we need to employ some of these design change features to make us more adaptable and more nimble in a very rapidly changing environment. Now, he made those comments pre-COVID and had no idea that there could be this worldwide pandemic. None of us could see it coming, but I think his words were wise because there continue to be, after COVID, hopefully soon we see the impact of that winding down. There will still be other things that challenge healthcare for sure. But that 5-step process follows: 1, empathize, understand what the issue is to your key constituents. And in this case, that's both our patients, but also our providers and our staff. Define, so come up with the ideas around, since we understand now what those challenges are, how can we create solutions to it? Ideate is that, hey, we have an empty chalkboard, let's throw ideas out here and let's really brainstorm and try to think of innovative solutions to the problems that our key stakeholders are facing. And then you create a prototype, and that prototype will not be perfect right out of the box. And that's where I think the traditional system tends to get stuck. We do sometimes let perfect be the enemy of good enough. And that's very different than technology companies. They like to get it out there. And then the last step is test and refine. We know it's not going to be perfect. You collect data, you refine as needed, but that gets your change process out there more quickly. And healthcare organizations may sit in that ideate phase longer than most because, there's lives at stake. Mm-hmm. But in this case, they were able to push past that, and within the matter of hours, literally, in some cases, they had converted the majority of their patient encounters to virtual visits, telehealth, telemedicine, phone, video, etc. And that, to me, is something that the healthcare industry should hang on to once COVID is hopefully a distant memory in all of our collective psyches.
Absolutely. That day will eventually appear, and we'll all be grateful. So, Joel, you talked us through the 5-step framework, and I'm curious, as you are working with organizations going through this rapid change, what are some of the things that you're finding that providers and administrators are learning as they move through this ideation, prototype, test, and refine? Because like you said, it's not something that's typical for us in healthcare. So what are they learning as they go through this, and what lessons have you seen?
I think the lessons will remain to be seen. We'll have to kind of get a little farther out to really know what stuck. But I would hope that these lessons, learned under near war conditions, and I've heard some people call this a war on the coronavirus. So maybe it is actually war conditions. I think people have learned, hey, look, when when we needed to, we were able to roll out wholesale and just fundamental changes to our business model in, a matter of hours. Mm-hmm. And I think that skill set, while we, desperately need the crisis to go away and can't be making and putting all of our decisions in the context of a global crisis, I think there are attributes of that speed of adaptation or adaptability that we want to hang on to. We proved that we can do it. And this was huge organizations all the way down to small private groups. So regardless of the model, that adaptability was able to be completed. And the speed at which it was done, it made it through these processes, to me, is something that I hope becomes a lasting attribute of the COVID-19 pandemic, a positive silver lining to an otherwise pretty horrible scenario.
Yeah, agreed. I'm curious, when you talk to members out there and other CV leaders, how are they actually making this happen so quickly?
Unfortunately, that's not something I can measure, Cheryl, but here's what I will say. And I think MedAxiom played a pretty significant role in this. The community sharing, I mean, just open sharing of knowledge and information, and in real time through, digital media and things, that was just amazing. And I think it really made a huge difference in changing over in such a short amount of time. What was learned in Virginia was shared across the country and implemented in Alabama or in Illinois or in California and vice versa. And that happened on a worldwide scale. We saw that through the ACC, the American College of Cardiology. Our parent organization was leading worldwide webcasts with countries that were on the front lines of this, including China and Italy and the European countries, et cetera. I think that was the main successful ingredient in all of this, is nobody kept any of that information to themselves. They shared it freely and openly with the community. And thankfully, there were organizations like MedAxiom that existed that could disseminate it and get it out there to the community. Otherwise, I don't think our response would have been as quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of these, and I've listened to them as well, the ideas that come up on some of these webinars are incredible. And then they hadn't thought of that yet. So now, like you said, it goes from Virginia to California and all back and forth because of all these communication channels. And Joel, any other attributes that you're seeing as you watch organizations move more quickly than others? Anything else that's in place in those organizations?
Well, this would not have hard data behind it or science, but I would predict that organizations that pre-COVID had highly efficient and highly effective governance and leadership structures probably had a leg up adapting over organizations where those infrastructure or that foundational element was not working well, and in some cases can be completely ineffective. But it's something that MedAxiom preaches. We believe strongly that at the foundation of an organization should be a highly functioning dyad-led governance and leadership structure, and that dyad being physicians helping set our clinical vision and the administrators executing on that. So if there were a single attribute that I would wish in advance for our organizations, it would be to have that highly functioning governance and leadership structure.
And as you are advising members about leading that change, so they've heard the ideas or they're obviously working very quickly in their own organizations, how are you suggesting they lead that change with their staff, with their providers?
Yeah, I would say transparency and frequent communications are paramount. Especially in a time like this, the anxiety level is heightened, and we tend to sometimes as human beings fill in lack of information with very negative thoughts and consequences. So I think that the transparency that was shown by the industry as a whole should be shown within an organization as well, and communicating all the way down to the frontline employees and staff. Because this pandemic is having a major impact on our economy, and healthcare was not immune to that. When we were able to convert as much as we could over to virtual visits, but you can't do procedures that way. You can't do a lot of our imaging and some of the other testing that is part of the cardiovascular portfolio. And those things in today's healthcare system generate revenue. And when that revenue is lost, eventually healthcare organizations have to do some expense corrections to match up with that new revenue reality. So that, I think staff know that, and they are very anxious of, am I going to have a paycheck in the future? And I think that openness and transparency goes a long way in that environment.
How have you seen any examples of organizations that are handling this type of communication well, the transparency and the honesty?
So there certainly are organizations that had some infrastructure in place to do virtual meetings with their employees, as well as converting their visits over to telehealth visits. But there were many that did not, and they have been very innovative in using everyday products like, Apple's FaceTime or Google's Hangouts and Zoom, which is a platform we're actually recording this webcast on, has made its services free during the pandemic. And we've all heard some recent security issues around it, so we need to be careful. But I know lots of organizations who have just taken advantage of these free services to communicate regularly with their employees through virtual means. We weren't perfectly prepared for this, obviously. It's something that nobody could have predicted, but I will predict we'll have better infrastructures in place, and let's all pray that it never happens again. But the next time that we have to communicate with people at their homes because they had to leave the workplace in short order, I think we'll be more prepared the next time around.
Yeah, well, and a lot of these things that you're raising now is this spirit of innovation that you talk about in your blog, and using WhatsApp or using Zoom or all these FaceTime, things like that everyone has, because everyone has a mobile device, more or less. So what do you think are some of the barriers that leaders are going to need to overcome after the pandemic to keep that spirit of innovation alive?
Probably the number one will just be that inertia back to the status quo, because the pandemic will, one day is too long, but in the arc of history will be a relatively short amount of time, and there will be a tendency for organizations to want to go back to, quote, normal, and that status quo, including the process they used pre-COVID for decision making and implementing changes. And, not to minimize the crisis that's at hand and suggest that, we're exploiting it or anything, I think it would just be a shame if that status quo entirely came back without some level of understanding, wow, when we had to, we really changed, and we made changes quick, and they weren't perfect, and we adjusted on the fly. And it was the best thing for our patients, the best thing for our staff, the best thing for our providers. There's probably some lessons in that we should keep forever.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think looking at those decision-making processes once this has passed and how we can keep that spirit of innovation in there is really important. And as you say, there's going to be a sense amongst many organizations to go back to the status quo, but it sounds like we're probably never going back. So,
yeah. And I think compounding the issue, Cheryl, is going to be the financial position of organizations, because nobody in the economy in the world is going to come out unscathed from this from a financial perspective, and healthcare is going to be on that list as well. And so in that environment, innovation tends to be blunted. And because everybody's just kind of tightening belts and hunkering down. So there will have to be an inevitable period of time for that, because I just don't see any way to avoid it based on the projections and the data we've received from our members in cardiovascular programs on the impact financially. But at 2, go out 3 years, 5 years. And again, I hope we all think of COVID as an interesting trivial pursuit question for later, that it, becomes that much of a distant memory for us all. But it would be a shame if we lost some of the agility that we've learned through this crisis.
Agreed. This is great stuff. And we are going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk about what you see as the future impact. We'll continue on this future thinking of this rapid change. So don't go away. Stay with us on MedAxiom Heart Talk. The COVID-19 situation is changing at a rapid pace. For everything you need to know, MedAxiom has launched medaxiom.com/COVID-19, a resource page focused on organizational information and support. Here, you'll find the article we've been talking about today, Reinventing Cardiovascular Care in 2 Weeks, An Industry Adapts to a Pandemic, and the COVID-19 webinar series recordings. Plus, you'll find links to federal and other agency guidance. All of this on our COVID-19 resource page at medaxiom.com/COVID-19. We're back to continue our conversation with Joel Sauer, MedAxiom's Executive VP Consulting. So Joel, as you mentioned in your recent article, there already were pressures on healthcare institutions to change. I mean, Amazon, Apple, Google, the consortiums with Warren Buffett, all kinds of things were pressuring healthcare. And each of them was a real threat to core businesses. Now, as you add to those pressures, the pandemic, what do you foresee starting in 2021 in terms of change that we might find and additional pressure to change?
Well, let me start with the change question because that's more fun.
Okay.
I just don't believe that we'll be able to stuff telehealth back in its original pre-COVID
Genie bottle.
I think that Genie has escaped and is tremendously enjoying its freedom. Now, I'll caveat that with Medicare will have to continue to pay more liberally for it like they are doing during the emergency. But the feedback from the community and from the patients has been so positive towards that change. And it just makes intuitive sense to me. You and I, Cheryl, we enjoy our ability to get so much of our world completed online. And healthcare was way behind in that. Even just being able to do something as simple as request an appointment online was really nothing more than an email saying, please. But I think the adoption or the adaptation to telehealth is going to be one of those lasting impacts of COVID. Like we talked about before the break, I certainly hope that our speed to change is a lasting impact as well. And, there are people that are saying the COVID fear, that kind of getting in large groups and just that total back to the normal social aspects of society probably are forever altered as well. We're all going to look a little bit differently this time around for any of that. And, you just start to peel that onion back and the mind reels with all the different permanent changes that none of us, I don't think, can predict, but we'll see. But I would say the main one will be that telehealth Genie coming out of the bottle. Now, in terms of the pressures, the list that you rattled off there in your question, I think that they're not going to go away. And unfortunately, the impact this has had on the economy and, the U.S. federal government pumping $2.2 trillion, which is just a staggering amount of money. And, we were in a deficit situation before that $2.2 trillion. So it's only going to exacerbate that. And my point in bringing that up is the reason healthcare was mainly under pressure from Google and Amazon and all those others was because it was just too darn expensive. Mm-hmm. That pressure is only going to magnify post-COVID because of the financial impact it's going to have. Trying to pull more revenue for Medicare payments, for healthcare payments in that environment is going to be exceedingly tough. And in part, our rapid response and conversion over to telehealth, which is a significantly lower cost platform than live visits, in some ways we kind of taught the rest of the world, hey, we can do this and do it pretty effectively. They may latch onto that and say, okay, not from a COVID response standpoint, but from a cost structure standpoint, we want you to even advance this further. Mm-hmm. So it could almost be like our ability to transform so rapidly comes back to haunt us because the world is going to say, keep going. We need you
the expectation
from a cost perspective. Yeah, exactly.
Well, what do you think about, stay on this thread with these tech companies you mentioned. Any thoughts about how they may step in and say, well, telemedicine was a big hit and you guys did change quickly, and maybe they step in with something that is able to do it cheaply and we have to adapt to that? Possible, yes?
Right, for sure. And I think probably tech companies are learning, you know what, we didn't build our platforms for an all virtual world. We were kind of promoting that, but when the world turned to us overnight, we've all experienced, and in fact, during the break, we were talking about some of the internet problems we were facing with this platform. So I think a lot of companies are probably looking at some re-engineering of their products. And then the interest, so MedAxiom has corporate partners that help our cardiovascular community to thrive. The partners that are in the telehealth space, their phones are absolutely blowing up. They can't keep up with the interest and demand. So for sure, industry is going to, the other side of the non-traditional healthcare provider community is also going to have to step up and adapt and learn to deal with a much higher volume, because that curve was COVID accelerated. Yeah. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. Well, let's tie together this continued innovative mindset and ongoing adaption and ultimately adoption of these technologies, and what you mentioned before the break, which was about the finances and the reality of that. How would you advise leaders to move their mindset, or at least start moving their mindset from that financial focus to the innovation mindset and keeping that going, given the realities of the finances?
I think it's incumbent on our leaders, and I mentioned this in the blog that you referenced, I think it's incumbent on our leaders to kind of reorient their thinking on that process that, I'll use the words because I think they're fair, are cumbersome and very, very time-consuming and arduous decision processes where they have been historically viewed as discipline, as a very positive attribute. This is fiscal discipline. I think we need to, as leaders, reorient ourselves to say that discipline may actually be dangerous in a rapidly evolving market. And there is just no way, pre-COVID, post-COVID, in the middle of COVID, anyone can look at healthcare and not think it's a rapidly changing environment. So I think that's the biggest takeaway for our leadership is let's kind of rethink what we've historically held as virtues and wonder if they're not hindrances in the current environment. Where I often hear Darwin misquoted survival of the fittest. That's actually not what he wrote and said. It was survival of the most adaptable. And in a dynamic environment like the world is going to be and was pre-COVID, but certainly going to be even more dynamic post-COVID, I just think that our historic virtues need to be reconsidered. And a big one is that process around decision-making and the timeline that was measured in literal years at times for those changes. I just don't think that's going to serve us well in the future.
Fantastic thoughts. That's a really, really thought-provoking, and I think you're spot on. Let's imagine.
We'll see.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Let's imagine. So, staying in the future here, let's imagine you're having dinner in December with 3 CV services leaders who their practice or their program has successfully come through all this. Maybe they're even thriving at that point in December. What do you think, if you ask them, what do you think they'd tell you about the factors that help enable their success? What did they do?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say MedAxiom and the ACC broader communities are rooting for them all being recovered by December. Let's hope that's the case, and we're going to do everything in our collective powers to make that so. I hope, again, that these organizations have shifted their mind thinking around change and have embraced the speed at which their organization did adapt under a crisis situation and took some of that skill set and said, we're going to make that permanent, absent crisis and absent an emergency of worldwide scale. We're gonna take some of those lessons and make them a permanent part of our org, and in fact have. That we, by December here, we went through budgeting processes and we totally changed our mindset on how that budget was established. Now that's probably too optimistic, Cheryl, because I think the financial hangover from this is going to be longer than December. But I hope and pray that things are pretty much back to normal from a societal standpoint, but that our organizations have made permanent some of the collective wisdom they gained through this. I don't expect that the sharing that we saw during COVID will go away, because frankly, it was there pre-COVID. Cardiovascular medicine in particular just seems very open to creating and sharing best practices around its healthcare delivery, and the results on cardiac mortality kind of speak for themselves. Now, doing that same around our processes and our care delivery models, and importantly, our cost structures, I hope that becomes a permanent aspect of the industry.
Joel, parting advice for how organizations can keep that spirit of adaptability alive after the pandemic is over? 30 seconds or less.
Well, going back to the MedAxiom foundations, the organizations that have a well-defined vision and strategy around their services do better. But it doesn't go anywhere if they don't have a high-functioning governance and leadership to make that strategy and vision happen. So if there are 2 things that I'll leave you with in 30 seconds or less, it's spend time on that vision and then make sure to put in place high-functioning governance and leadership. And if you don't know how, we're here for you. Call out to MedAxiom and we can help.
Terrific. Wise words. Joel, thanks for being our guest today on MedAxiom Heart Talk.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the podcast. As you work at home, get a run in, or listen to MedAxiom Heart Talk in the car, you'll always find us on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've been enjoying our program, please take 2 minutes to review it on your podcast app. Or if you'd like to give us feedback directly, send an email to hearttalk@medaxiom.com.